Welcome. This video will provide an overview of the economic impact of the coronavirus shutdown. Let's start by looking at the daily number of new cases. Cases increased from 0 in January to over 30,000 new cases per day in the beginning of April. Cases leveled off over April and the beginning of May and declined between the beginning of May and the end of June. As states began to open up, new cases increased, reaching 75,000 new cases per day in July, and cases dropped over the second part of July and August. Since the beginning of September, cases have started increasing again and are now over 40,000 new cases per day. These new cases translated into new deaths. New deaths increased up until April, declined significantly from April to July, and increased a little bit at the end of the summer and decreased a little bit into September. When we look at the average number of deaths per day from July to September, we do not see very much change. There have been about 800 deaths per day over those 3 months. 800 deaths per day is 24,000 deaths per month, both in the number of new cases per day and the number of deaths per day. Things have been pretty constant over the last couple of months, and there's no reason to expect that those patterns are going to change in the near future. Let's turn to looking at economic outcomes and start with gross domestic product, GDP, and real gross domestic product, the gross domestic product adjusted for prices, in the green. Both measures of gross domestic product fell significantly from the fourth quarter of 2019 to the second quarter of 2020. The gross domestic product fell by 10.4%. Real gross domestic product fell by 10.2%. How does the level of real gross domestic product in the second quarter of 2020 compare historically? The level in the second quarter is about the same as the real gross domestic product in the first quarter of 2015. That is, the size of the U.S. economy in the second quarter of 2020 is about the same as the size of the U.S. economy in the first quarter of 2015. A big part of the decline is the decline in industrial production. Industrial production fell by 15.9% between January of 2020 to May of 2020. And there's been a rebound so that the cumulative decline since January 2020 is 7.3% in August of 2020. And again, when I compare that historically, the level of industrial production in the country in August of 2020 was about the same as the level of production in March of 2006. Let's return to looking at the national accounts and personal income measured in trillions of dollars. Personal income is shown in blue, the top line in the graph. Two of the main components of personal income are compensation, shown in green, and proprietor income, shown in purple. Both of these decreased during the first 2 quarters of 2020, and especially compensation, which decreased by 9.4% from the 2019 to the second quarter of 2020. However, personal income increased, and increased by a lot, 8.7% during the coronavirus shutdown. Why did that happen? Transfers to individuals increased, and specifically transfers from the government. Those are shown in pink. The increase in transfers more than offset the 9.4% decline in compensation, the decline in proprietor income, the decline in other, resulting in the 8.7% increase in the size of personal income. The government transfers during the pandemic were unemployment benefits, shown in purple, and other benefits through the CARES Act payroll protection, not included in unemployment benefits, shown in orange. Those increased by about $3 trillion. The impact of this government spending on the federal government deficit was large. Federal revenue is shown in blue. Federal expenditure is shown in green. Revenue decreased during the shutdown. Economic activity was lower, so tax revenues were lower. Spending per quarter more than doubled during the first 2 quarters of 2020. During the second quarter of 2020, the deficit was $5.7 trillion. Expenditures were 2.6 times revenues. If we look at the accumulated deficit during the current presidency, from the first quarter of 2017 to the second quarter of 2020, the accumulated deficit was $17.6 trillion. How does that compare historically? The accumulated deficit during the second Obama administration, from the first quarter of 2013 to the fourth quarter of 2016, was $9.8 trillion. So the accumulated deficit during the last 3.5 years was almost double the deficit accumulated during the second Obama administration. Our relationship with the rest of the world has also been affected by the coronavirus shutdown. Exports are shown in blue. Imports are shown in green. The difference between them is the trade deficit. Both exports and imports declined during the coronavirus shutdown. Exports decreased by 28.5%. Imports decreased by 23.9%. This means that the trade deficit increased during the first 2 quarters of 2020. If we look at the level of exports in the second quarter of 2020, how much our producers are exporting to the rest of the world, and compare it to historic levels, in the second quarter of 2020, the level of exports was about the same as it was in the fourth quarter of 2007. Unemployment rate increased from historic lows in beginning of the year to around 14%, and then have declined. I've divided this up into states that voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 and states that voted for Donald Trump in 2016. The level of unemployment in August of 2020 was about the same as the unemployment rate in 2012. Part of the difficulty of measuring the true unemployment rate is that during the pandemic shutdown, many people have dropped out of the labor force. If there are no new jobs created, it's difficult to be actively looking for a job. And the labor force participation rate fell significantly at the beginning of 2020. It's rebounded a little bit, still below the level prior to the shutdown. This means that we need to recalculate the unemployment rate to truly reflect the people who drop out of the labor force and the people who are being paid even though they're not actually working. Part of the pandemic assistance was to provide assistance so that people would not be laid off from their jobs. They have a job, but they're not actually at work. The increase in the number of people who were employed but not at work between February and August of 2020 are people who really should be counted as unemployed. The people who are not in the labor force aren't able to actively look for a job but would take a job if they got one. The increase in the number of people in that category between February and August should also be included in the unemployed. We can recalculate the number of employed, which the official statistics count as 147.4 million people in August of 2020, to exclude the people who were not at work to get the adjusted employed of 143.8 million people. The number of unemployed, officially 13.6 million people in August of 2020, should also include the increase in the number of people who are not in the labor force but want a job, 2.2 million people, and the increase in the number of people who are employed but not at work, 3.6 million people. If we do that, we end up with the adjusted number of unemployed is 19.4 million individuals. The pandemic unemployment rate, taking these adjustments into account, is 11.9% rather than the official 8.4%, so a 3.5% increase when we make this adjustment. The pandemic unemployment rate reached a peak of 21.7% in April and has declined since then, but is still quite high by historic levels. Mean weekly earnings of those that have a job decreased significantly during the coronavirus shutdown. The mean earnings decreased by more in states that Hillary Clinton won in 2016 than states that Donald Trump won in 2016. How are these patterns in income affected by the increase in the stock market? Not that much, because households in the bottom 40% of the income distribution tend not to hold stock directly or indirectly. Only 3.9% of households in the bottom quintile hold stocks directly, 6% of households in the second quintile. Overall, the direct and indirect of holding of stock of those households is 11.6% and 32.5%. Those households are not impacted very much by the rise in the stock market. What are the conclusions of this brief overview? First, coronavirus cases and deaths are likely to stay at their current high levels, with the result that it will be difficult for the economy to return to normal. Second, gross domestic product and industrial production are unlikely to get back to their pre-pandemic trajectory until coronavirus cases and deaths decline. Third, the unemployment rate is unlikely to return to pre-pandemic levels. The longer that workers remain unemployed and businesses are closed, the more difficult it will be for workers to return to employment. Fourth, the increase in the federal government deficit is going to have significant impact on economic activity in the future. The government's going to need to repay the deficit. If it doesn't repay the deficit, there will be crisis of funding. All of this will result in lower economic activity in the future. And then fifth, household income is likely to remain below pre-pandemic levels, especially at lower ends of the income distribution, because of the decrease in economic activity and the elimination of the government transfers during the pandemic that were keeping household income above pre-pandemic levels.